This is Platemark with me, Ann Shafer. I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking, although my career was as a works on paper curator, so we covered drawings and photographs and books as well. But prints is my first love, I admit it, and here I am, trying to support the print ecosystem by introducing listeners to all sorts of people from across the ecosystem. Today's guest is Jennifer Roberts. She is a professor at Harvard University, and she is one of those people who is deeply curious about the world and has for the last 10 years or so been deep in print, which is good for us. So we talk about a book that got published last year called Contact, Art and the Pull of Print, which is based on the Mellon Lectures she gave during the pandemic, a set of lectures that are sponsored by the National Gallery of Art in Washington. The book is super conversational and super accessible in the best way, and it aims to engage a wider audience beyond, traditional print people like you and me, trying to put forward an idea, a fresh perspective on printmaking that synthesizes simple maneuvers like reversal and pressure to account for the medium's expansive influence. And I'll tell you, the influence is everywhere, as we've talked about on the pod. Other cool things we talk about, Jennifer kind of backed into print by looking at 18th and 19th century dissemination of images within the Americas way back in the day, and started out looking at how oil paintings might have gotten over from Europe and other places. But she found herself completely captivated by the idea of currency engraving, which is an intricate craft demanding the production of unreplicable reproductive objects. A little bit twisty and mind-blowing there. We also talk about some of the classes she's been able to teach at Harvard of her own design, which have been super cool. And one of them includes an assignment of long looking, which was profiled in the New York Times recently, where she assigns students a 3-hour looking session before they even start investigating and researching the artist or the work itself. And I've always said prints reward scrutiny, and she's backing me up on that one. And then finally, we talk about a really cool collaboration she is embarking on with artist Dario Robledo, who is really a wonderful artist. You should look him up immediately. Their joint work is delving into the realm of printed sound, and specifically looking at the Golden Record, which is a phonographic record, an old-fashioned LP, that was sent into space on the Voyager probes way back in the 70s. And it points to Jennifer's penchant for exploring the intersections of all sorts of things like materiality and meaning and communication within both the earthly and cosmic contexts, as well as intersections of art and science and the evolution of visual culture. So we go all over the place, but I think it's a really worthwhile conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay, housekeeping. I identify as a cis-het white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. There aren't very many images, actually there are no images, going along with our conversation today. Instead, on the show notes, you'll find links to some of Jennifer's books and also one to the video version of the Mellon Lectures, which is over on YouTube. So that's what you're going to find there. Okay, I think that's it. Let's get rolling. Jennifer, it's lovely to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we've been trying to get you on for two years. I just looked at the first email contact.
I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's not your life intervenes, as we know.
Yeah.
But now is the perfect time because you have published the book, Das Buch, on prints and printmaking that is changing the way we all think about it. So, perfect timing. But before we do that, can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, my name is Jennifer Roberts, and I teach art history at Harvard. I've been teaching there for 22 years now. And nominally I'm an art historian, and I am here to teach American and contemporary art. But my interests are sort of all over the place, and I haven't been staying in my lane very well. But I have been here for 20 plus years teaching whatever seems to come into my mind.
This is something that I have often thought about with you because you came heavy and hard into prints, and it feels like we're losing you. I'm like, no, come back. Everything's astrology. It's astrology, astronomy.
Astronomy. Yeah.
Shoo. Everything's astronomy now. Oh my God. I'm like, wait, come back, Jennifer.
Well, it's true. I am moving off, although I have been actually working in and around print for over 10 years now. So it does feel like, even though the book is just now coming out, it feels like the end of a very long process to me, given that it began really back maybe 2011, 2012, when I first started getting interested in prints, and then the s3e Lectures and the Mellon Lectures, and it's finally out in print. I'm still working on print, but I am moving off into other kinds of projects.
So because we're a printmaking podcast, what was it that initially hooked you?
Yeah, I entered print kind of in a strange way. I mean, I think the first time I came across print was when I was writing my second monograph called Transporting Visions, which was about basically how images got moved around in the Anglo-American world in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I was really interested in movement and dissemination, although interestingly, that book was not supposed to be about print at all. I really wanted to think about what it meant to take an oil painting and put it in a crate and ship it across the ocean, and what does all that mean? So I was trying actually to avoid print because that seemed like the too obvious way to think about dissemination. But then I was looking at some 19th century painters who were trained in engraving, and it turns out that most 19th century American painters, just in order to survive in a world without the kind of patronage you had in Europe, had to be trained in another field. And often they were trained as engravers. And some of them that I was especially interested in were trained as currency engravers. So I got super interested in currency engraving, in how you actually engrave paper money in the 19th century. And that is really one of the strangest and most philosophically complicated ways to get into engraving and print, because if you're a currency engraver, you need to be able to make what I like to call a non-reproducible reproductive object. You have to print something that then can't be replicated again. You're always having to worry about counterfeiting and, how can I make this print that can't then be reprinted? So I was immediately thrust into these really interesting questions about what it means to have value as a set of lines on paper, and how those kinds of paper were moving around the country in the 19th century. And then it forced me immediately into these really interesting technical considerations about literally what kind of paper do you use? How do you make a line that can't be copied? And so I got right into this weird side world of print. Like ornament on currency, for example, was a big thing with me for a while. And I became more and more interested in how those kinds of considerations were filtering into painting in the 19th century. And then at around the same time, I was asked by the curator of contemporary art at the Harvard Art Museums to do a little pocket exhibition with the group of students about a Jasper Johns painting that we have in the collection called The Dutch Wives. And that turned into a semester-long course with a very small group of students, just 3 or 4 undergraduates. And we thought, okay, what can we say about this Jasper Johns painting? Let's do something with it. And that ended up becoming a whole class that was about print and the way print was informing Jasper Johns' work. That's how I got into Jasper Johns, and then also very deep. Of course, Jasper Johns is another great way to be introduced to print and printmaking, just because he's so smart and self-conscious about virtually everything he's doing in the medium. So that turned into a much larger exhibition than we had planned. I ended up writing an essay for the catalog called The Printerly Art of Jasper Johns, which was really the first thing that I had written about print. And so that really got me hooked. So Jasper Johns and currency engraving, sort of strange entries, but that was my first work with print. And I was very lucky that I was, at Harvard and getting into print through our collections. And we have had a run of fantastic print curators in the Harvard Art Museums. First Jerry Cohn, then Susan Dackerman, now Elizabeth Rudy. I've been very lucky to work with all of them.
When you were talking about the currency piece, and it having started as an idea about how paintings travel, were
Mhm.
you conscious of a certain prejudice against print? And because I think everybody's trying to avoid, whenever you read anything, they always leave out the prints. Like, we know that's
Yeah,
how this whole thing went.
right, right, right. Well, absolutely. It's something that I was always conscious about. And it was one of the reasons that I really decided to throw myself into it, because I wanted to advocate for the intellectual and technical richness of print, and also the way I felt that it was always there in all the other media that were trying to exclude it. And so, yes, I was very much aware of that. And I was also a product of the prejudice against print. So I had no training in print or printmaking whatsoever. So, you often in this podcast talk about the ecosystem of print. And I like to think of myself as I certainly did not evolve in that ecosystem. I was like an invasive species coming in from somewhere else.
I don't think many of us did, honestly. I mean, I backed into print, I mean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so I did my undergrad at Stanford, and I was a double major in English and art history. At that point, I was studying mostly American art and the decorative arts and material culture. And then when I went to grad school at Yale, I continued in American art, but then I also did a lot with modern and contemporary art. My dissertation was about Robert Smithson. And that dissertation was an attempt to look at his work through the lens of 19th century American landscape and the 19th century in general and the whole question of history. So I was at Yale doing American art and then modern contemporary art. In neither case was I expected to know anything about prints in order to get a PhD in those fields. And I think it was particularly a problem in modern and contemporary. No one was talking about print at all. And maybe that was just a function of my particular PhD upbringing. But as I think I mentioned in the acknowledgments of my book, I got a PhD in art history, and I could not have told you in 2001 the difference between an etching and a lithograph. I had no idea. I know there are some fields in art history, notably early modern Europe, the world of Dürer, where you can't really be an art historian without knowing a lot about print. But that was not true in modern and contemporary at all. I was trained in the sort of theoretical world of, the lit crit world of the 90s in grad school. That was not a field that was very interested in printmaking per se. Yeah. And then everything was about painting and sculpture. So,
Yeah,
and a little photography.
a little photography,
Yeah.
maybe some performance or something.
Yeah.
But it's an age-old tale. Like it's amazing to me now. Like, once you're in the world and you see it everywhere and the tentacles run through everything, you're like, how can
Right.
these people miss
Right.
all of this richness? It's insane.
Right.
But
Right.
the intersections with the commercial aspects, I think, are always one of the major problems. Like, they can't quite. It's like the prejudice against the deck arts, right? Like, it's all utilitarian
exactly.
and whatever.
Right. Right. And I think a lot of what I've tried to do in this book is really make it impossible to separate print from all of these higher status media. And I think you can see that particularly just looking around in contemporary art. So much of what has been taken to be painting is, in my mind, actually coming out of print. And that's also true in photography. I think photography is full of print. And that's something that I wasn't able to fully develop in the book. But the history of photography in the 20th century is probably 85% actually a history of the halftone and printed photographs on paper. And it's a world that students of history photography don't really get to interact with very much, at least until recently.
Right. I feel like there's always like that first layer of subject matter that the PhD people's, kind of go for. And now we're doing like the history of the exhibition and blah, blah, like there are these layers, and finally we're getting down to the halftone.
Yes.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, thanks to people like Ben Levy. So,
right.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, as our mutual friend Ben Levy is studying, the intersection of the two is beautifully. They're printed photographs, and it's a fascinating history. And nobody's nobody's really codified all of the various forms and the history and the timeline and all that stuff. So.
Yeah, I taught a very small course, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, just about commercial printing in the late 19th century, because I was really interested in wood engraving and trying to get a feel for just how prints got into the illustrated media. And it was amazing to see how kind of complex and yeasty that ecosystem was in the later 19th century. So many strange commercial processes that are mixing mechanical and chemical techniques. You've got people working in all kinds of industries around the print world at that point. There are all sorts of tentacles in and out of painting, and there was almost no literature about it. So a lot of what have tried to do in this book actually is give people an entry into print, a sort of introductory level entry into print that can raise some of these other questions about what print is and what it can do and how it connects to the rest of the arts. This is sort of the book that I always wanted to have in my own teaching.
Right.
That's what they say, write the book that you want to have existing.
But it is a good, I think it's a good introduction, but it also goes so much farther than that in my mind. Like there are themes and ideas that you put in there. I'm like, oh, I'd never thought of it that way. It was really eye-opening. I thought it was really great.
Yeah, I mean, it's a proposal, I think, for a new way of just framing the field, in essence. I don't have the kind of detailed, perfect, specific procedural technical knowledge that a lot of print scholars have. I have quite a bit, but I'm not a print expert, say an etching expert or lithography expert at the same level that many of my colleagues in the field are. But what I tried to do, what I hoped my contribution would be more on the level of a new synthesis, a kind of synthetic approach to print that would reorganize the structures that we use to enter into the field, just to see what happened. What does the medium look like if you look at it through these very simple physical operations? What pops up through that lens, through that filter? What does it open up? What does it make possible? And in particular, how does it attach different kinds of, what I like to call different kinds of receptors to prints, to make print recognizable to painters and sculptors and people who imagine themselves to be outside of the field? How do we put print in a kind of conceptual framework that makes it sort of inseparable from everything around it?
The book and the lectures upon which they're based, the Mellon Lectures, for people who don't know, are a series annually that the National Gallery pulls together. And it's usually some fantastic scholar, but the subject matter can flip from ancient to modern to print to sculpture. And you did it during the height of the pandemic. And does it always follow that the lectures turn into a book, or was that a project that you grabbed and said, no, let's make this a book?
It is part of the Mellon system. You're supposed to give the lectures and then make a book out of them. Not everyone does so, but it is sort of built into the contract. So essentially, you do the lectures and then you're guaranteed, unless you really mess up, you're guaranteed to be able to publish them as a book. And they have an arrangement with Princeton University Press to publish the Mellon Lectures. And I would say, I don't know, maybe 60% of the Mellon Lectures go on to be published. Sometimes people hold on to them for 10 years and really change them and expand them and turn them into something else. But I decided that I wanted to keep the book pretty close to the lectures. I mean, the book is a moderately edited version of the script of the lectures that I gave. Yeah, I mean, and I think that the pressure of having to deliver them in this video format during the pandemic forced me to write them in such a way that they were probably a little more accessible than they would have been if I had just been standing at the National Gallery, speaking to the National Gallery Mellon Lecture regulars. As soon as we realized that my Mellon Lectures were going to fall in the middle of the pandemic, we had to decide whether to postpone them or to try to do them in some kind of video format. And it was a really interesting process because it wasn't just going to be Zoom. They wanted to do something that was a little bit more produced. So
because of the National Gallery.
Right. But I mean, I was just sitting in this room with some borrowed studio lights, and I had no training in this kind of video production. But once I got over the sort of full face quality of giving the lectures, which is strange because normally when you're giving a live art history lecture, you have the luxury of being this tiny little person in the corner, right? That nobody can see, but you actually have to emote with these full video productions. Anyway, it was a really interesting process because I got to incorporate video, which helped with explaining print processes. it made the whole image production much more deliberate, and I could put a lot more weight onto the images I was showing in the video. But it also meant that anyone could watch these Mellon lectures, at the moment that they were released. And I felt that I really wanted to make them as broadly accessible as possible because of that, for other reasons as well. But that really pushed me into that. And so once I had all those scripts written, I was pretty happy with them, and I didn't want to interrupt the flow of the argument by vastly expanding the text or by making it more academic. So I tried to just keep it conversational. The Mellon lectures I was really, really thrilled to have a chance to talk about print in that venue, because the Mellon lectures confer a certain prestige on whatever content you bring to the table for the Mellon lectures. And the other thing that's great about them is that they are watched by people throughout the art world in every different field. So I thought it was a really great opportunity to put print right in the middle of art history, put it on a soapbox, in essence. It seemed like a really good opportunity to get people's attention who wouldn't normally tune into a set of lectures about printmaking.
Right.
So my hope there was that it would be a way to bring print to a broader audience.
At the back of the book, there's a handy dandy list of the past Mellon lecturers going back to, here's the book, people, going back to 1952. And I scanned the more recent ones, but I didn't scan completely to see if there were other topics around print.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Oh, okay, good.
I suppose I should know that.
No, it's okay.
Now I'm looking back at my copy too.
But my question is, do you have any idea how they came to you in this topic? Like, it seems like print is always, off in the back corner. Like somebody must have been like, maybe you should ask Jennifer to weigh in.
No, I don't think they asked me because of print. I think they asked me because they wanted me to give the lectures.
Oh, okay.
I had given a couple lectures at the National Gallery before, and I had just published the book on art transportation. So I had a name more in the world of material studies and its relationship to art and to material culture, and also just modern and contemporary art generally. So I don't think they were actually expecting me to talk about print. So,
but nor did they
I
say
snuck
no.
it in. It was the Trojan horse. Yeah.
I do remember the sort of the buzz going around amongst our print colleague types that the gallery was actually going to focus on print for a half a second, and how thrilled everybody was that this was all going to come together. So I'm glad you did it.
Well, of course, the National Gallery itself, it has a remarkable print collection.
Yes.
And, I had spent a lot of time there looking at every John Cage Byrne print and everything by Rauschenberg I could get my hands on. And of course, they too have a remarkable run of former print curators who have really defined the field. So it was also wonderful to be able to do that at the National Gallery.
Right. I know, you sort of wonder if there's another institution that could pull that kind of thing off like that,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder. In the Met, maybe. As we're recording this, you're giving a talk this week, and I just wanted to ask you, how are you going to approach it? You're not, I know you're not going to just stand and regurgitate the book. I know you better than that. What are you going to tell them?
Well, it's actually, so it's at the Print Center, New York, in their beautiful, amazing new street front gallery in Chelsea. I wouldn't even call it a talk. It's more like a conversation, a panel conversation with one other person. And it's really going to be quite informal. And I am doing a limited series of conversations. I've got one in Washington in September, and then I did one at Princeton a few weeks ago. But this one I'm really excited about because I'll be in conversation with Matt Saunders, who is an artist who teaches at Harvard. And he is the person with whom I have been teaching for many years now a course called Critical Printing, which is a hybrid studio and seminar course about print. And so we'll be talking certainly about the book, but largely through the lens of pedagogy and print pedagogy and what it means to be both a scholar and a maker and vice versa, and how writing and printmaking go together. And in general, all of the ways in which teaching that class with Matt has influenced the way I think and talk about print. So it's also hopefully going to be about, the connection between print and contemporary art more broadly, the often hidden and yet very much latent connection between print and contemporary art. But yeah, I've been teaching this class with Matt since maybe 2017, not every single year, but just about. And it's a small seminar that's based at the Carpenter Center, which is the studio art building at Harvard. And we have 3 hours a week of studio printmaking, where the students are learning how to do most of the processes, but with an emphasis on etching and intaglio. And then 3 hours over in the art museum looking at prints and talking about print theory and history. So it's really an attempt to do a true hybrid experience for the students where they are learning about print while they're also making it. And we're trying to put that kind of embodied experience of learning print together with projects of looking and writing and getting them to see what they can learn by having to do both of those things at once. So they have a final print project with a final critique, just like a studio class would. And then they also have to write a paper at the end. I asked them to write a paper in the form of an exhibition catalog about their work and their projects. So they have to sort of step out of themselves and write about their work from an art historical or art critical perspective. And it's just been such a joy to teach this class. I've learned so much from Matt, and we have both learned the print collection extremely well. I get to basically curate a little exhibition every week in the study center of all the prints about pressure, or what have you, whatever the theme is of the week. It's just such a privilege to be able to do this. Yeah, so the talk on Wednesday will be just the two of us sort of chit-chatting about that in relationship to the book.
Nice. When you go over to the study room at the museum, is Elizabeth helping you, and does she weigh in?
Elizabeth has consulted with me extensively about the collection, and I'm always bugging her to send me the latest list of new acquisitions, and we talk a lot about teaching. She wanders into the room to see what we've pulled very frequently, but actually I just usually am sitting on the couch going through the collections database, looking for things I don't know about. By now I know the collection pretty well, and I have a pretty good sense of what to pull every week. But it's been really interesting just digging through every screen print in the collection. The past semester, I sat down and I looked through all, I think it's 1,200 screen prints in the collection, just on the collections database, just to see what was there.
You know, screen print was always sort of last on my list because it always felt so flat and everything. But over time, you know, as we grow, we grow in ourselves. Now I'm kind of like, wow, this is really cool. And the way that people are manipulating it now, it's just like, wow, so great. Yeah.
As someone who has done a lot of work with pop art and contemporary art, screen printing felt very familiar to me. And it's the probably, least appreciated print technique within print, which is the least appreciated medium. So I was really happy the way the book turned out to be so extensively about screen printing. Actually, there's just a little bit too much screen printing in it, probably. but I feel like I was able to kind of bring screen printing into maybe a different place. There are more interesting things to say about it than I think have been said in the past. And so I'm hoping that it will continue to be carefully studied by people in the future.
I really appreciated it because I love a good Moiré, the interference of pattern on pattern on pattern. And I always think of it in terms of the Mellon Sudarium or the Holtzius, this, that, or the other. And of course I was aware because of my colleague Ben, who's very into those pulque, the interference prints that he was doing, that there was a through line into contemporary, but there was this kind of, there was this extra dimension to your discussion. I was like, it's just sort of like everything was just, just a few more layers on top. I'm like, oh God, look at that. That was really great.
Well, I had a friend of mine who's a designer send me an article about the way physicists are now using the Moiré effect to generate superconductive materials. And of course, I love that because it's a great way of showing that these techniques printmakers use for visual art are very closely tied to the world of industry, the world of science, that the Moiré pattern isn't just an effect, it actually does things. It actually produces things. It makes things happen, not just visually, but literally in this case. And I'm always looking for that moment when the lyrical passes over to the literal. In fact, I like to think of them both as being inseparable at some level. And this was a great moment in working on this Moiré topic, because it really felt like this is not something that should just be understood as a nuisance. It is something with real agency that's happening in the printmaking process.
What I love about you. I'm an in the weeds person. Like, I'm looking at each individual, if not halftone dot, but at least the print.
Right.
But you're up in the stratosphere here, and you're like, the ideas are huge and everything, especially that whole Moiré thing in the lyrical moving into the practical, is just an argument for the importance of having people create art and thinking about all of these issues and the creative brain. Like, as all of the schools are shutting down around us, it's a real mistake. It's a trip up. It's not good.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also an in the weeds person. And I think maybe that's one way to think about what I'm trying to do in this book, is to show how you can both be down at the level of the halftone dot, but even when you're quote unquote down there, you're still in a kind of constant connection with the biggest ideas, the biggest mysteries of the world and of art. I came to print from a series of projects that had to do with the intelligence of making. I had been working with my colleague Ethan Lasser, who was formerly the curator of American art at the Harvard Art Museums and now runs the American wing at the MFA Boston. But he too is also very much interested in making and the intelligence of making. And we taught a class together called Minding Making, which was a graduate student for art historians. And the whole class was about what is the status of artisanal knowledge in art history? Essentially, why don't art historians have to make things? Why are we not expected to make things? And why is that not the kind of knowledge that seems relevant to what we do? Certainly, there are art history programs where you are expected to take some kind of studio course, but I was never in one of those programs. I was never expected to make anything. So this was a class that was really about, well, what kind of knowledge is there in making? What is it? What do you know and what do you learn when you have to produce something, whether with your hands or with a machine? And so I had been thinking a great deal about that. And then we had also developed a short-lived series of workshops that we called the Maneuvers Project, where we were looking for ways to get the act of making to be better connected to the conceptual world of art theory and art history, and also to create a way of looking at processes of making that wouldn't be locked into tiny little technical disciplines, but ways to think about making more broadly across different spheres. So across science and art, or across the decorative arts and the fine arts. And so our solution to this was to come up with a series of really simple maneuvers that sit at the heart of all kinds of making, and sort of trace them across a really broad landscape of production. So for example, we had a workshop called Reversal. And this is one of the other reasons why I got really interested in reversal in printmaking. We had a workshop on just cutting, just the act of cutting as something that is sitting at the center of all kinds of different processes. Cutting is both a super basic maneuver, but it also links in etymologically and conceptually to all kinds of forms of language and ideas, like cut to the chase. You think of all of the ways that we think about cutting as actually a kind of thinking or speaking. So there are those connections. And then it also, moves across all different kinds of different media. So I like to say that the most stimulating day I've had in my entire academic career is the day that we took some students to a sawmill in the morning and watched a sawyer take a log apart, and the way he thought about cutting as a kind of way of seeing into this form and kind of diagnostic tool, and all of that expertise. How is the blade sharpened? Where do the offcuts go? All of these great little technical details about how do you cut a log up. And then we went to a neurobiology laboratory at Harvard in the afternoon and spoke to a neuroscientist who was cutting up mouse brains into 30 nanometer slices and doing a detailed map of basically how we think. And both of these people we were shocked by how similar their ways of thinking were about the processes that they were using. And in fact, Jeff Lichtman, the neuroscientist, is now in the news because his brain map is just being published in full. But anyway, those kinds of connections across very simple maneuvers were just incredibly stimulating to think about. It changed the way I think about all the arts. And you can really see the sort of echo of that in the Contact book, because each chapter is like that. It's a very simple thing that happens in print that also happens in the other arts. So it's a kind of connective tissue. So there's reversal and pressure, all these really basic things about printmaking that are in fact incredibly profound, I think, and connect printmaking to many different other kinds of media. So yeah, I mean, the making part is really essential to me, as is making the argument that the world of art making is every bit as intelligent as the world of writing about art making. I'm working against the longstanding Western prejudice against the material,
Well, yeah, I mean, the conceptual framework of applying an action across however many strata it's not strata, it's the, you know what I mean?
Right.
Is the great equalizer, right?
Right.
The sawmill worker is right up there with the...
Right. And we didn't know there's no conference in the universe at which a sawmill worker and a neurobiologist are going to be on a panel together, right? Talking about their connections. And that was the kind of thing that we were actually trying to build a little bit, and just to see how that intelligence is working across multiple different fields. So yeah, it was really a wonderful project that has ended up heavily influencing this book and my whole approach to print as well. So the section on Willie Cole, where I'm talking about the relationship between ironing and printmaking, by the way, both techniques are dealing with certain ideas about pressure. It just would never have happened if I hadn't gone through this whole interest in maneuvers.
Oh, huh.
Yeah.
It didn't just pop fully formed in your brain one morning when you were waking up. It was this accumulated knowledge over years and years of thinking through all this stuff.
Yeah, I think so. So it's definitely a kind of a strange angle into print, but I like to think an angle that I did have a few years to think about. Yeah.
One of the benefits of it is the same idea, which is that the theoretical conceptual art historian person and the maker person, like, it's the great meeting point, really.
I've also had a bit of experience in printmaking myself, both with teaching with Matt. I think it's very important to watch printmakers and talk to printmakers, but I do think it's also important to make some prints if you're going to be writing about them. And it's an interesting question, because when you are a full-time faculty member, art historian, and you're busy with a lot of things, you can't really become a master printer. You can never get enough studio experience. You can't get enough studio knowledge. And that always bothered me. But I've come to realize that even the limited experiences I've had in print studios have been so formative for the way I think, that I'm really an advocate for studio practice as a way of art history, as a way of thinking, a way of working as an art historian. And, interestingly, probably my first big print studio experience was actually making monotypes. After the Jasper John show I did at Harvard, I was asked to do the catalog raisonné of Johns's monotypes. And this was a bit frightening at first, because I didn't know anything about monotypes really. And, the literature on monotypes is limited. It's getting better, but it's quite limited compared to the rest of the field. And so I thought, okay, well, I better learn to make monotypes. That's going to be my research method. And that was really transformative for me, not only because, it was just any kind of studio practice, but it helped me see printmaking as something other than reproductive, or other than only reproductive. Sure. So the other thing about the book is that it tries to bracket out the whole theme of reproduction for a little while, just to talk about other things. Of course, we can all go back to reproduction, but I felt that the conversation about print had become, I felt a little bit stuck in the reproductive zone. And so I wanted to take us out and think about other things. And if I hadn't taken that class on monotypes, I'm not sure I would have really been able to see all of the other ways that printmaking works, all the ways you can make prints without necessarily trying to make copies. So that really got me thinking about things like reversal. And I was constantly working with this etching press and sending stuff in and getting stuff out and looking at all the transformations that happened, having to do all the backwards thinking that you have to do when you're a printmaker. It was a really transformative experience for me. And even just something like little things that you could do in a writing project. I was writing about Corita Kent's screen prints for an essay I wrote for a catalog of her show here at Harvard. I was just writing about her screen prints and her stenciling process. She did cut paper stencils for her screen prints famously. And I was interested in the way she was kind of reversing these letters and terms in her work. And I thought, well, maybe I should at least see what it's like to cut out a paper stencil. So I just got a piece of paper and just started cutting some letters, as a negative stencil. So leaving the outside of the paper, but cutting a letter out in the middle of the stencil, and just doing just that process of moving that sheet of paper around and looking at the way the scissors were pivoting and the fact that I was constantly having to turn it over to get the right angle on my cutting. It was embarrassing how much I learned from just spending 10 minutes cutting the letter N out of a piece of paper. It completely transformed the essay. Suddenly I understood all of these questions of reversal and transparency that became central to the discussion. So you don't have to take a full studio MFA course in order to learn from making, but you do need to do something.
Yeah. The thing that in your book that we are really focusing on is the conversation you had with Amy Silman and the whole behold and hold discussion.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that you and I are very on the same page about getting into the studio and understanding what it takes. But do you really think that it's the same for the artist, that they need to come out into the sort of theoretical conceptual world in which we are writing or talking?
Well, artists are forced to take art history classes.
True enough.
So already there's a lack of reciprocity there. They have to take art history, but we don't have to take studio. So that's a problem. But yeah, I think it's a really good question in terms of just whether artists and art historians need to be in a reciprocal relationship and whether words and making go together. Personally, in all the work and teaching I've done around the notion of the artisanal and its relationship to conceptual knowledge, there's a pretty standard sensibility that there is such a thing as sort of tacit intelligence, that in the act of embodied making, whether it's making an object or being a concert pianist, that working with your body and making things is somehow an area of activity that is off limits to language, that it is unspeakable in a way, that it's tacit and that's its value, that it's off limits from language. And while I fully agree with this at some level, yes, it's true that if you're in the middle of playing a piano concert, you don't want to be thinking about it too much. Right. You don't want your mind to get too closely involved. You want to be, working through the embodied skill that you have. And while it's true that I do think that getting down into the material stratum and struggling with the physical world is outside of given language in a certain way, I don't think that you can't bring language to the situation. So for example, when you say you can't write about making, that doesn't make sense to me. I mean, that's like saying you can't write about a flower. I mean, maybe you can't exhaust that flower with language. You can't nail it down. But, as an art historian, I see that my job is to take these material phenomena, whether process-based or object-based, and I'm challenged by those things that sit outside of my way of thinking and talking. And I need to find a way to find the words and to find the language to try to reach that thing that challenges my preconceptions. So I think it's really important to try to bring words to the scene of making. They can never meet there, but it's really important to me to bring words and making onto the same plane and have them struggle with each other, because otherwise we just leave making in a position of unspeakability, and that I think will only replicate its subordination as it's been. If words can't reach into making, then it's easy for people to just leave it to the side and not have it be part of the way we think about things. So,
and the art world, the current contemporary art world is so dependent on the maker, but equally
yeah,
dependent on people like you and me and whoever else
right.
interpreting it
Mm-hmm.
to elevate it into this billion-dollar business, right?
Right.
I mean, we don't have
Right.
to get into the market, but I do have a
Right.
question for you about your approach to an work of art that you've not seen, that you're pulled into a critiquing session or something. Do you have a framework, an approach that you use when you're trying to take something in and respond to it?
That's a great question. I mean, when I'm working, in my office or in the museum and coming to a project and looking at a work of art, I have a very kind of strict method of extreme close looking and close attention. And, in fact, I think I'm probably, if I'm known for anything, it's my 3-hour looking assignment that I have in all of my classes, where I force my students to look at a work of art for 3 hours before they go to the library and do any research. And, there are some guidelines, there are things to look at. So, but I do really emphasize a very close period of attention to the work so that the work is what's driving the questions you end up asking in research, right? So that you're not just bringing someone else's questions to the work. Of course, inevitably, you're bringing things to the work, but I'm trying to maximize the amount of weirdness that you see in a work, because the longer you look at something, the less familiar it gets, the more it starts opening up into all kinds of contradictions and questions, which then become sort of handholds for further discussion. But of course, you can't have a 3-hour looking session in a final crit or in a sort of rapid turnaround kind of an environment. But I still always try to start with the work as something that's been made and looking for aspects of the work that seem to be fighting each other, or there are points in the work where I can see some kind of conflict trying to be worked out or some kind of compromise being formed. Places where it looks difficult, where it looks like it was difficult to make or difficult to conceive. Because I think, if anything, what's most important is teaching students to understand that art is not easy and that no image should be taken as a given. Artists don't make works of art because they're trying to get into art history textbooks, although maybe that's a side ambition. But artists make things because the world is complicated and contradictory, and they're trying to solve problems. They have questions that they're trying to work through in the making of works of art. And I always want that kind of dynamism to be present in any situation where you're discussing something that someone has made. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh no, I'm trying to think through your process.
Elaborate. Yeah.
I mean, it's the rapid fire critique situation is really difficult, and I've talked about it many a time. Like, I, as a person who was just starting out doing it, I was like, I don't think I can ingest this fast enough to come up with something
Right.
useful to say to,
Right. Well, I do still think, I'm not so habituated to the final critique that I don't think it's really strange. It is a very strange
Yeah.
anthropological ritual. I mean, as is every ritual in every academic setting, but coming at it from the outside, I still find it odd. And one of the things that Matt and I talk about a lot is just, what is the role of words in a final critique? What should the students say about their own work when they get up and present it to the group? That's a really fraught question, and one that I don't think I have a complete answer for. But yeah, the crit or the rapid fire response is a place where words and making come together in the most explosive way, and it can cause tears, as we've seen. As I'm sure you've seen.
I have, sadly,
on many levels.
I'm sorry, everyone.
Yeah. It's also really amazing to watch PhD students in art history have to go through a final crit with their own work, especially the ones in contemporary art, because that really changes the way you look at other contemporary art when you've basically had to go through the process yourself.
Yeah, I don't think that I ever really had to stand up and be critiqued on my art history. Like, I mean, I think there was sort of a half-assed,
Right.
panel of some nature, but it wasn't really like.
Right. The dissertation defense doesn't have the teeth that I think it used to.
Yeah. No. I mean, I
Yeah.
didn't have to do it. I only have a master's, but it's,
Right.
yes, it's, I think that might be terrifying to
Mhm.
have to go through, honestly.
Right. Right. But I mean, I spent some time in architecture school critiques in grad school, and I was exposed to the studio model of sharing your work and art and studio critiques in other settings. And I did find that it does, there's a way in which it solves a lot of problems that students have in the humanities, because in general, the humanities, until really very recently, your job as a student is to sit down by yourself in front of your computer and make something without talking to anybody, and then handing it in and hoping 3 weeks later you get a few marginal comments on the side from your professor. So there isn't really, again, until very recently, there wasn't a way to be public about your work, to think about working through ideas publicly with your peers. And the studio situation was always, for me, an inspiration in that. And it changed the way I taught my seminars. So I teach my seminars as much like workshops as I can, and have students, share writing early, share the whole process of their writing with their peers, try to make it a little bit more like standing around a room looking at an object.
So do students all read each other's work as it goes?
Not always, but I usually will have them present and discuss their work in progress every couple of weeks in a seminar when I can, when there's time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember in grad school, I had a couple of classmates who probably would have balked at this idea because they were so paranoid that someone would steal their idea, to the point where they had all of their books turned in on their Carol shelves so that you couldn't see the spines,
Right.
so no one would take the book. I'm like, really? Are we really worried about that? There's like 12 of us here. And I'm
I
not
mean,
interested in Italian
I'm gonna
Renaissance.
err on the side of sharing.
Right. Me too.
That's my, that's my
I got nothing to hide, people.
yeah. And also just like the basic idea that when you write something, when you put something out in the world, it isn't the final word on anything. It just opens up possibilities for other people to think about where this idea can take things down the line.
Yeah.
And certainly the book that we're obliquely discussing here is an attempt at that kind of a spirit in print studies. This is by no means the last word about anything. And what I really hope will happen is that it will lead to all kinds of new dissertations and new ways of thinking, and giving students more possible paths to carry the field in the future. Certainly my own students, but anyone that reads this book, what I hope will happen is that it will give them ideas for changing their work, either as an art historian or as an artist. And what's been most gratifying to me so far, like I really don't know how this book is doing. I don't have any stats. I don't have any reviews. It's all still very murky to me. But what has been really most gratifying to me has been hearing from printmakers, printmaking students, particularly people teaching printmaking in studio programs who are using it in their introductory printmaking classes. And that's what I really wanted this book to do. So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, I think as a springboard for students, it's there's so many, there's so much in it, and so many avenues you could go down and explore.
And it was painful to have to just write these 6 chapters. I mean, there were so many other things I would love to have said and done.
Do tell. What are we missing?
Well, yeah, I mean, I saw so many possible further paths. For example, the whole question of the connection between print and photography, I think, still needs an enormous amount of work. There's so much to do there, and people like Ben Levy are really starting down that path now. But it seems inexhaustible to me, and that would change the whole way we think about the relationship between print and photography, and it will change the way we think about what photography is. I had another chapter on circuit printing that I couldn't quite fit within this scheme. I did end up writing a paper about it, which I delivered as a talk at Yale last year, which someday I'll try to publish. But that's one way of thinking about this whole question of the death of print in the digital world. The whole argument of that paper is that how can print actually be dead when the circuits that are running the digital world that is supposedly killing print, when those circuits are themselves prints? Because circuits are basically manufactured using tweaks on traditional printmaking processes. So thinking about that whole question that, we're still very much running on print, which in the larger sense is about all the ways that print and printmaking is completely imbricated in what it means to make anything now, 3D printing, organ printing, we're printing ourselves now. And there's so much to talk about still in terms of the way what we see as fine art print methods are out there doing things in the world, making solar panels and making, blood vessels. It's all part of the history of print. And it's a pretty nice way to keep print from becoming irrelevant if you're really thinking about those connections and talking about them. The whole connection with textiles, the relationship between print and sound are both two areas that I'm really interested in at the moment. And also just kind of humble office printing in the 20th century. There are great new projects coming out. Michelle Donnelly's work on Xeroxing is going to be great. But yeah, the Xerox, the mimeograph, the Ditto machine, all of these humble little low-scale printing technologies of the mid-20th century. Yeah, there's so much to do. Not to mention non-Western printmaking procedures and the way we talk about the relationship between the West and, say, East Asian printmaking. There's so much to do there. Yeah.
Yes, I have avoided diving into the Eastern traditions because it's so huge. I mean, there's so much. Jesus.
I know, but it's so good.
I know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's really important that we start getting these traditions to talk to each other because they have actually talked to each other historically. But now, because of the way the fields have been divided up, it's hard to really get those conversations going. But
we need to get some texts translated, I suspect.
Right. God, well, that too. Yeah. Yeah.
Problem number one.
Yeah. But there are other ways through it. Like if you think about, if you really wanted to dive in, say, to the relationship between print and textiles, then you quickly end up in, block printing, and fabric printing, which takes you all over the world very quickly and is a global question as well as a gender question. So there are ways that print can be expanded further that will automatically expand its transnational reach.
Yeah. I mean, print is, as we both know, everywhere. And I don't think it's dead. It's a long way from dying. I agree with you. I mean, I feel like I'm always yelling from the rooftops about it, but I also, at the same time, know that I am yelling to the same choir, right. And it's like you kind of have to like slip it in there for all those people who are like, print? No way,
Right. Right.
Exhausting.
And that's part of why my book, the last word in the title is print. Like, it's actually almost an afterthought. I'm trying to get people to pick this up who are not already print people.
Right. Exactly.
That's the whole challenge, is how do you get someone who's not already converted to just stumble into all these connections? And I do think actually that, my period of post-war America, I learned it as a history of painting, but then once I knew something about print, I went back and looked at, Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and Warhol and all of these figures that I was taught drove painting forward in the later 20th century. And in modern painting, I realized, well, actually, everything they were doing was taking a print method and putting it into painting. So what does that mean? And that was a fundamental question. If you can pose these questions that way, where you're speaking to, say, painting people in a language that they know, I think it is possible to open this up so that when you're looking at a painting, you understand that you're also looking at a print.
Okay, so now I can say that I forgive you for drifting off out of print after 10 years, because I think it is people like you who are like, oh, hey, look, there's this thing, let's deep dive. And then, you are known in other aspects of the art history world. So, go on with your bad self.
Okay.
But before I let you go, you're working with Dario Robledo, an artist whose work I really like. And do you want to just give us a little synopsis of what you're doing with him?
Oh, wow. All kinds of things. So I commissioned him to do an exhibition at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, where I was doing a little bit of curating a few years ago before the pandemic. And that's how I met him. But I had been following his work for a long time because he's he, like me, is very interested in what's the relationship between material and meaning, between the stuff that art is made of and the ideas and meaning that we assume it holds. After that show, we realized we just had all the same interests and had all the same questions. So we decided to keep working together. And it's really exciting to be working with an artist as an art historian. Also weird to be actually working with an artist as an art historian. Yeah, so we're writing a book together, and this is part of my move into sort of science and astronomy questions. To put it as quickly as possible, it's a book that is very obliquely about print. It's about printed sound. It's about records and recording. And specifically, it's a book about what's known as the golden record. And this is a gold-plated copper phonographic record that was bolted to the side of the Voyager probes, which were launched from the Earth in 1977 and are now the farthest objects from Earth in the universe. They're outside of the solar system, 15 billion miles away. And on these records is a collection of music and speech, also images. There's this whole art historical photo history angle to this, and sounds from Earth that were put on this object just in case, in the most infinitesimal possible future, billions of years from now, this object is found by some alien intelligence. So it's completely preposterous, of course, right? But this is an object that forced people to think very, very hard about what it means to be human, what it means to be on the Earth, and what it means to try to communicate and hold meaning and pass it along to something that is completely unknown, some complete otherness. So it's been really thrilling to work on this, but it's a book that's about meaning and language and images, but also very much about science, like what happens when you send something outside of the solar system for 5 billion years. Like, where does it go? Turns out it just wanders around the galaxy several times. But it's about a specific recording on the golden record, which is a kind of medical recording, a life signs recording that was made by a woman who felt that there needed to be other stories on the record. There needed to be a kind of feminist history on the record. There needed to be more diversity on the record. There needed to be more emotion on the record. So it's both about a kind of official Earth monument and the counter monument that was attached to it. So yeah, it's out there, but it'll be done in about a year. But it's been such fun working with Dario. I mean, he's totally brilliant, and we're both writing it. It's not like he's doing the images and I'm doing the writing. It's a real collaborative effort.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
I have a 24-year-old who likes science fiction, and he read The Three-Body Problem, which is now a Netflix series, which I'm not sure he's watched.
Yeah.
And he terrified me with the whole recounting of the plot line a couple summers ago. And I was like, good Lord. And he said, this idea of sending out these friendly hellos into the stratosphere is a mistake, because anyone who finds it and is close enough to us to get it is going to come and get us.
Right. I mean, I take the opposite view, and that is that this is about how would we live our lives if we really truly understood how big the galaxy is, just how much space there is between us and anything else. There isn't warp drive. It doesn't exist. Probably never will. And if, say, there's some other entity, 100 light years away, that means that any message will take, even if it was super efficient, at light speed, it would take 200 years before you can even have two sides of a conversation. And that's really optimistic. So
we'll be dead.
Really about this is a one-way communication. This is like the last word. This is the last testament of the Earth. What do you put on there? Do you tell the truth?
Right.
Who gets to go on it? What's your format? That's where it kind of comes into print. Like, in what way can something that's an impression, whether it's of a sound or an image, really hold meaning forever? Where does meaning just give up? Where is it lost?
But what's the technology? The disc, isn't the disc an LP? Did I dream that?
Yeah.
So they're going to have to figure out that a needle needs to.
Yeah. I mean, okay, I was not expecting to have this conversation.
Oh,
but there is, They did. There is actually a stylus
Okay.
like behind it, and a huge amount of time and effort went into figuring out how would you explain to something that
God.
you have no idea what kind of body they have or what kind of mind they have or whether they have vision or fingers or whatever. Like how do you convey how to play this thing? And it was a really interesting set of processes. But it's really about holding meaning. Like how do you hold meaning in matter and send it from one mind to another? And that's what artists do every day. You know, they're taking a bunch of material and trying to imprint it with some kind of meaning and hope that somehow it's understood on the other side of wherever it is they're sending it. You know, usually they're just sending it to New York to go on this show, but you never really know who your audience is going to be. And you never really know whether your message is going to get across. And this is just a kind of limit case of that question. And print is about holding meaning and hoping that it gets picked up on the other side. So I think actually these projects are kind of similarly constructed, but one is just much more extreme than the other.
I like your use of the word imprint on the material that you're working with, because it is all back to print, people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's actually a copper record, so it's a lot like, a copper plate engraving. It's just a copper plate engraving that has sound waves instead of contour lines.
That's cool.
It's the same technology.
Yeah. And Dario's the perfect, he's always working with sound. That's great.
Right, exactly. And he's really inspired me to think about the relationship between sound and print.
Yeah.
As well. I mean, because sound is this thing that we don't imagine as being material. It's ephemeral. And if you want to pass sound around the world, you have to print it. You have to lodge it in this material artifact. So it's been so interesting to think through all these questions with him. It's been really a joy. I feel very lucky to have this kind of collaboration.
That's awesome. I have a musician brother who is a avid listener of Platemark. I get a review after every episode, which is awesome. And he early on was like, I've been thinking about the parallels between music, and he's a classical musician, so in liturgical music, and the parallel of the additioned artwork and how much later the recorded sound availability and additioned, impressions came from music. And it's just, it's fascinating.
Right. Yeah, no, Dario is very interested in the history of sound recording, which interestingly came out of the history of physiological recording, like bodily recordings. It really wasn't until the mid-19th century that you could actually record sound. And it's a much later printing technology, we might say. I mean, of course you have notation, but that's very different. That's a symbolic representation of sound. Actually recording a sound, indexically, as we say in print, imprinting it is something that doesn't happen until the mid-19th century. You don't know what singers from the 14th century sounded like. Right. There's no way of knowing that. No. But then there's also one of the things that's really interesting to me about sound recording and sound printing is that you take the sound and you print it in the matter, but then you can get it back out again, right? You pull it back out and it gets transferred back into sound. So print is just the storage medium for something ephemeral. And I love thinking about how that relates to what visual printing does.
Right.
Certainly in the early modern period, in certain sort of spiritual ideas about printing, you actually would treat visual images that way as well, where they would be transmitting to you some kind of spiritual energy, that's stored, and then you look at it and it comes back out almost as if you were listening to it on a turntable.
Huh. So, interesting.
Yeah, print is a storage medium, just like sound recording. Oh, it's for storing and moving meaning around.
Right. Oh my gosh. Lots to think about, Jennifer.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
I know. I can't even keep my own head straight on this stuff.
I know you opened with, I'm all over the place. I'm like, yep, yes, she is.
Yep.
But that's good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a curious mind.
I hope not, because
as long as you can somehow relate it back to your position as an art historian in the roles of the Harvard faculty.
I do feel like this book that we're talking about has boundaries. It's pretty clear.
Oh, absolutely.
all of the sort of fuzz out of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah. And on behalf of the entire print ecosystem, thank you for writing it. We really appreciate it.
Well, I'm very, very, very happy to be and to have been part of this ecosystem, because I can't think of anyone I'd rather talk to than a printmaker, printer. It's been such a joy to get to know everyone in this world. I was really intimidated at first, actually. It can be intimidating, but I've had such wonderful conversations with people, and people have taught me so much. It's just been a complete pleasure.
Right. Yeah, no, I love talking to the printers too. They're fascinating. So great. All right. Well, we probably ought to wrap it up. Any things you'd like to share?
Wow, I don't think so. I think I've probably talked your ear off. I really, really appreciate having a chance to come talk to you today. So thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, as we said at the top, we've been trying to get you on for 2 years, so I'm glad it all worked out finally. All right. Well, thank you again for coming on Platemark. It was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Ann.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Platemark with my guest, Jennifer Roberts. I think it's one of my favorite conversations we've ever had, because it's so far-ranging, but it also synthesizes all of the things we all feel about print and its importance, and why people should pay attention and love them as we do. A thank you to her for being a wonderful guest. Thanks, Jennifer. Also, thank yous, as usual, to Dan Fury for being my sound guy. Thank you so much, Dan, and to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. And also, thank you to Lee Turner and Skip Barnhart for their studio sounds that they sent to me, that I mélanged into the soundcast or the landscape. The sound landscape? What do we call that? The sound landscape at the top and bottom of the pod. Thanks, guys. Okay, links to things we talk about on the episode are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. You can also do me a favor and sign up for our newsletter. You'll get news about episodes and other stuff sometimes, not very often, I promise. And also join our Facebook group. It's a cool group of nearly 800 people sitting around chit-chatting about all sorts of stuff. So come on over. The water is fine. All right, we will see you next time.